disaster did not begin when the Soviets launched their counteroffensive. It began months earlier. It began when German planners underestimated Soviet strength. It continued when Hitler divided his forces across southern Russia. It grew worse when German commanders ignored warnings about their vulnerable flanks. It accelerated when the Sixth Army became trapped in a brutal urban battle it never should have been fighting. And it became irreversible when Hitler refused to let his army retreat. Stalingrad was not one mistake. It was a chain reaction, a series of bad assumptions, flawed intelligence assessments, logistical failures, command disagreements, missed opportunities, and catastrophic decisions that built upon one another until an entire army found itself surrounded on the banks of the Volga. Today, Stalingrad is remembered as the turning point of the war in Europe, and for good reason. The German army would never fully recover from what happened here. But the most fascinating question is not how the Sixth Army was destroyed. The fascinating question is how so many experienced commanders, supported by one of the most effective military machines in the world, managed to make so many critical mistakes in such a short period of time. In this video, we are going to follow every major German mistake that led to the catastrophe at Stalingrad, from the planning of Case Blue in the summer of 1942 to the final surrender in February 1943. Because by the end of this story, Stalingrad no longer looks like an unexpected Soviet victory. It looks like a disaster that Germany spent months creating for itself. The first mistake at Stalingrad was made before a single German soldier had crossed the Don. It was made in a conference room by men with maps in the spring of 1942. And it was a mistake not of tactics or logistics, but of fundamental strategic vision. After the failure to take Moscow in the winter of 1941, Operation Typhoon, which had brought German forces to within sight of Moscow's outer districts before Soviet counterattacks drove them back, the Wehrmacht faced a choice. The war in the East had not ended in the single campaign season that Hitler and the OKH, the Army High Command, had planned for. Germany was now committed to a war of attrition against a nation of nearly 200 million people, with industrial resources that had been moved beyond the Urals, beyond the reach of German air power, and were now producing weapons and equipment at a rate that German intelligence consistently underestimated. The question for 1942 was where to strike. Hitler's answer was the South. Operation Fall Blau, Case Blue, was designed to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. The Baku oil fields produced roughly 80% of Soviet petroleum. Without that fuel, Soviet tanks and aircraft could not operate. The war would end, not in a single dramatic battle, but in an industrial strangulation. The logic was not irrational. Germany itself was acutely dependent on imported oil, and the Romanian fields at Ploiești were already under pressure. A southern offensive that captured Caucasian oil while denying it to the Soviets would address Germany's fuel vulnerability while crippling Soviet operational capacity. But the plan as designed required the simultaneous achievement of several objectives that were, in combination, beyond German capabilities in 1942. Army Group South, the force assigned to execute Case Blue, would be split. Army Group A would drive south into the Caucasus, toward the oil fields. Army Group B would drive east, secure the Don Bend, and establish a defensive flank along the Volga to protect Army Group A's northern flank. The city of Stalingrad, sitting astride the Volga at the point where the river bent closest to the Don, was initially a secondary objective, important primarily as a communications center and a point to be secured or neutralized rather than captured. Here was the first error embedded in the plan itself. The assumption that two army groups could simultaneously achieve objectives that were diverging geographically and logistically, along a front that would extend to more than 1,000 kilometers, with supply lines already stretched to their limits. The German military had made this kind of geographic overextension work before, in France and in the opening campaign of Barbarossa. But those successes had depended on rapid operational movement. the encirclement and destruction of enemy forces before they could reorganize. In the summer of 1942, the Soviets had learned. They were retreating rather than standing and being encircled. They were trading space for time, pulling back faster than the Germans could close their pockets. The result was that Army Group South was advancing, sometimes 50 or 60 kilometers a day, through vast stretches of territory without destroying the Soviet forces it was supposed to destroy. The enemy was escaping. The pincers were closing on empty steppe. German commanders recognized this. They reported it. The encirclements of 1942 were catching far fewer Soviet troops than the encirclements of 1941. The enemy was weakening, yes, but not fast enough, not decisively enough. Hitler's response to these reports was revealing. He dismissed them. He interpreted the Soviet retreats not as evidence of a surviving Red Army conserving its strength, but as evidence of imminent Soviet collapse. Each day of advance confirmed his belief that the enemy was finished. Each kilometer of captured steppe was proof that final victory was close. This pattern, the reinterpretation of ambiguous evidence as confirmation of pre-existing belief, would define German decision-making at Stalingrad from beginning to end. The strategic plan also contained a timing assumption that would prove fatal. Case Blue was supposed to achieve its objectives before winter. The Caucasus oil fields were to be captured, the Volga was to be reached and secured, and defensive positions were to be established, all before the ground froze and Soviet reserves could be brought to bear. That assumption required everything to go right. Nothing did. But in July 1942, as the panzers rolled east through the Don steppe in columns of dust and exhaust, the miscalculations embedded in Case Blue were not yet visible. They were invisible, buried in optimistic planning assumptions, in intelligence estimates that undercounted Soviet reserves, in a command culture that had learned to tell Hitler what he wanted to hear. The trap was being constructed. Its builders did not know it yet. On July 23, 1942, Adolf Hitler made the decision that would define the next 6 months of the war. He changed the objective. The original Case Blue directive had designated Stalingrad as a secondary target, a city to be reached and neutralized, not necessarily captured. The priority was the Caucasus oil fields. But in late July, as German forces approached the Great Bend of the Don and Soviet resistance began to stiffen around Stalingrad, Hitler issued Führer Directive 45. Directive 45 ordered the simultaneous full pursuit of both objectives. Army Group A would continue south into the Caucasus, and Army Group B, with the 6th Army under Friedrich Paulus as its primary instrument, would take Stalingrad. Not contain it, take it. The change was driven by a combination of factors, none of them sound. Hitler had become personally fixated on the city. Its name was Stalin's name. Taking it would be a symbolic as well as a strategic victory, demonstrating the invincibility of German arms against the Soviet dictator's own city. This symbolic dimension was not operationally irrelevant. Propaganda has military uses. But it was beginning to override operational logic. There was also the matter of the Volga. Control of Stalingrad would sever the river as a Soviet supply artery, cutting the flow of Caucasian oil northward and isolating Soviet forces south of the city. This was a genuine military consideration, but achieving it required the capture of a major urban center that was now being reinforced by the Soviets against a defending force that was fighting for the first time in the 1942 campaign with unusual determination. General Franz Halder, then Chief of the Army General Staff, recognized the problem immediately. Directive 45 split Army Group South's already stretched resources between two diverging objectives, neither of which could be adequately supported. He said so in the careful language of a staff officer who had learned that direct opposition to Hitler's decisions had career consequences. He was overruled. Halder's concerns went beyond the immediate resource allocation problem. He had been watching the intelligence assessments of Soviet reserve strength, and they troubled him deeply. The Germans were capturing prisoners at a far lower rate than in 1941. The Soviets were pulling units back, reconstituting them, and feeding them back into the line. Soviet production, even in the chaos of relocation east of the Urals, was recovering. The Red Army was not collapsing, it was reorganizing. In August 1942, Halder told Hitler directly that Soviet tank production had recovered sufficiently to replace battlefield losses in full. Hitler, according to accounts of the meeting, screamed at him. The figure was impossible. The Soviets could not be producing that many tanks. The intelligence was wrong. The intelligence was not wrong. Meanwhile, the flanks of the German advance toward Stalingrad were a source of growing alarm to every German commander who examined them honestly. As the 6th Army pushed east toward the city, its flanks, to the north and south, were being held not by German forces, but by Allied armies. Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units equipped with lighter weapons, less artillery, and significantly lower combat effectiveness than the Wehrmacht divisions they were replacing. This was not a secret. German liaison officers attached to the Romanian and Hungarian armies were sending reports about their equipment deficiencies and the vulnerability of their positions. The Romanian Third Army, holding the northern flank of the German salient, lacked adequate anti-tank weapons. A Soviet armored attack against that flank, launched in sufficient force, could break through quickly. The question was not whether Soviet operational planners had noticed this vulnerability. They had. The question was whether the Germans would reinforce those flanks before the Soviets could exploit them. They did not. And as August turned to September and the 6th Army began its grinding, house-by-house assault on the ruins of Stalingrad, the question of the flanks, deferred, minimized, set aside in the urgent arithmetic of the city battle, was waiting for an answer. The answer would come in November, in a form that no one on the German side had adequately prepared for. General Vasily Chuikov had one order when he was given command of the Soviet 62nd Army on September 12, 1942. Hold the city. The west bank of the Volga, the bank where Stalingrad stood, was to remain in Soviet hands. Period. No withdrawal across the river. No surrender of the west bank. Hold at any cost until the situation could be reversed. Chuikov understood immediately what holding the city would require. He described his tactical insight in later memoirs with characteristic directness. To survive against German superiority in air power, artillery, and mechanized forces, Soviet defenders would have to eliminate the space in which those advantages operated. They would have to fight so close to the Germans that German air power could not strike without hitting German soldiers. So close that artillery coordination became impossible. So close that the battlefield fragmented into hundreds of individual struggles in basements and stairwells and factory workshops, each one decided by the soldiers immediately present rather than by commanders looking at maps. This became known as hugging tactics, staying within grenade range of the enemy at all times. It worked, and German commanders failed for weeks to find an adequate response to it. The 6th Army's assault on Stalingrad began in mid-September with a confidence born of recent success. The city had looked, from the German perspective, like a final obstacle, battered by weeks of air bombardment, defended by exhausted Soviet units, ripe for the kind of rapid advance that German tactical doctrine was designed to produce. General Paulus believed the city would fall in days. It did not fall in days, it did not fall in weeks. It became something that German military training had not prepared the Wehrmacht to fight. A sustained attritional urban battle with no clear front line, no flanks to envelop, no position that could be taken and held without immediate counterattack. Here the tactical errors compounded. The first was the failure to adapt. German doctrine, the doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, was not designed for this environment. It relied on combined arms operations, on the integration of armor, infantry, artillery, and air support across open terrain. In the ruins of Stalingrad, tanks became vulnerable to anti-tank guns in buildings, to infantry with incendiary weapons emerging from rubble, to the simple geometry of narrow streets that eliminated their ability to maneuver. German officers who recognized this lobbied for adjustments in how forces were committed to the urban fight. The adjustments came slowly, incompletely. The second era was the progressive commitment of the 6th Army's best units to the city fight. The 6th Army contained some of the most experienced and capable divisions in the German military. As the battle continued and Soviet resistance remained unbroken, these divisions were fed into the urban meat grinder in an attempt to force a result that tactical brilliance alone could not achieve in that environment. Each day of fighting cost the Germans veterans they could not replace. Each day of fighting cost the Soviet soldiers they could replace, by ferrying reinforcements across the Volga at night, under fire, in small boats. The Volga was a Soviet advantage that German planners had fundamentally misunderstood. Yes, controlling the river was a German objective, but the Soviets needed only a narrow strip of the West Bank to maintain their bridgehead. And maintaining that bridgehead, however costly, was sustainable so long as the river could be crossed. The Luftwaffe bombed the crossing points. Soviet boats sank. Soviet soldiers drowned. But the crossing continued, night after night. The third era was the diversion of Luftwaffe effort. The 4th Air Fleet, the air formation supporting operations at Stalingrad, was simultaneously tasked with supporting Army Group A in the Caucasus, interdicting Soviet supply lines, bombing Stalingrad itself, and providing close air support to ground forces in the city. These demands were mutually contradictory. The fleet could not adequately perform all of them. What resulted was a dispersal of air effort that satisfied none of the requirements completely. And beneath all of these tactical errors lay a strategic one that was growing more dangerous with every week the city battle continued. Every day spent fighting for Stalingrad was a day not spent reinforcing the flanks. Something was being planned on those flanks. German intelligence knew fragments. Soviet radio traffic had increased. Troop movements had been detected. Supply concentrations had been identified east of the Don. But the full picture, the shape and scale of what was coming, remained unseen until it was too late to stop it. Operation Uranus was not a secret. Not entirely. The Soviets, aware that German signals intelligence was capable, took extensive measures to conceal their preparations. Radio silence was imposed on certain units. Troop movements were conducted at night. Supply dumps were camouflaged. The operations planners, Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, working directly under Stalin, limited knowledge of the full plan to a tiny circle. But the preparations were on a scale that made complete concealment impossible. Moving hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and the logistical infrastructure to support them across the open steppe north and south of Stalingrad, while keeping this entirely invisible to German reconnaissance, was beyond the reach of even the most careful operational security. German intelligence saw pieces of it. German aerial reconnaissance identified concentrations of Soviet forces in the Don Bend, north of the German salient. Reports from the Romanian Third Army's sector described unusual activity, the sound of armor at night, bridges being strengthened, roads showing heavy use. The reports reached German intelligence officers. Some of those officers, reading the fragments carefully, reached alarming conclusions. One of the most prescient was Major Einsmann, a German intelligence officer attached to Army Group B, who submitted assessments in October and November 1942, warning that Soviet forces were concentrating on the 6th Army's flanks in numbers suggesting a major operation was imminent. His assessments were forwarded up the chain of command. They did not change decisions. Why not? The answer lies in the pathologies of the German command system in 1942. The first pathology was Hitler's influence on intelligence assessment. Hitler had established, through 2 years of war, a pattern of dismissing intelligence estimates that conflicted with his expectations. Officers who submitted unwelcome assessments faced career consequences. Officers who confirmed Hitler's optimism were rewarded. The result was a systematic bias in what intelligence assessments concluded and how they were presented. The second pathology was the echo chamber at OKH. Franz Halder had been dismissed in September 1942, replaced by Kurt Zeitzler, an officer who was initially more willing to accommodate Hitler's views. The institutional culture at Army High Command had shifted toward compliance rather than honest analysis. The third pathology was specifically about the Soviet capacity for large-scale offensive operations. German commanders consistently underestimated Soviet operational sophistication in 1942. The memory of the catastrophic Soviet performance in 1941, the encirclements, the staggering prisoner totals, the apparent disintegration of the Red Army, created an assumption that persisted long after the evidence demanded its revision. Soviet forces had been getting better. German commanders did not fully believe it. There was also a specific failure of imagination. The scale of Operation Uranus, 3 army groups, over 1 million soldiers, nearly 1,000 tanks attacking simultaneously on 2 axes, was larger than German planners believed the Soviets capable of mounting in the winter of 1942. The logistical complexity alone seemed, to German eyes, beyond Soviet organizational capacity. This was a catastrophic misreading. Soviet logistical and planning capabilities had improved dramatically in the 18 months since Barbarossa. Zhukov and Vasilevsky had spent months preparing Uranus with a care and thoroughness that matched anything the Germans had achieved in their own offensive planning. The Soviets were ready. The Germans did not believe they could be. On November 18, 1942, the last normal day before the storm, German 6th Army reported to Army Group B that the situation was stable. The city fighting continued. The flanks were holding. Winter was coming, but operations could continue. The next morning, November 19th, the Soviet guns opened fire. The barrage lasted 80 minutes. Then the tanks came. The Romanian Third Army broke in hours. Not because the Romanian soldiers were cowards. They were not. They fought, many of them, with determination. But they were infantry fighting without adequate anti-tank weapons against a Soviet armored force that came through their positions with a mass and momentum that their defense was not designed to stop. The Soviet assault on November 19th, the northern pincer of Operation Uranus, struck the junction between the Romanian Third Army and the German 11th Corps, with 5 tank corps and 2 infantry armies. The breakthrough was immediate and catastrophic. By the end of the first day, Soviet armor had penetrated 30 to 40 kilometers into the Romanian position. The Romanian units in the path of the assault were encircled, reduced, and in some cases destroyed. The southern pincer launched the following morning, November 20th, striking the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad. It faced the same fundamental problem: infantry against armor, inadequate anti-tank guns, no armored reserve capable of counterattacking. Both pincers drove toward the same point, the town of Kalach on the Don, approximately 80 kilometers west of Stalingrad. When they met on November 23rd, the encirclement was complete. The 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army, roughly 300,000 soldiers, were surrounded. Now came the moment at which the German mistakes became irreversible, or rather, the moment at which the irreversibility of earlier mistakes was confirmed by a new set of catastrophic decisions. General Paulus, commanding the 6th Army, received reports of the Soviet breakthrough on November 19th and immediately grasped their significance. He requested permission from Hitler to withdraw the 6th Army westward, to break out of the developing encirclement before it closed completely. A fighting withdrawal, conducted immediately, while the encirclement was still forming, might have extracted significant forces. It would have meant abandoning Stalingrad, abandoning the equipment and positions that had cost so much to take, but it would have preserved the army. Hitler refused. The refusal was instantaneous and absolute. Stalingrad was not to be abandoned. The Sixth Army was not to retreat. It was to hold its positions and await relief. The generals around Hitler were not uniformly silent. Some argued for a breakout. Some presented the case that the Sixth Army could not survive a winter encirclement, that the Luftwaffe could not supply it by air, that a relief force would take weeks to assemble and might not break through. Hitler overrode them. Here was perhaps the most consequential single mistake of the entire Stalingrad campaign. The window for a breakout existed briefly in the days immediately following the encirclement. The ring was not yet solid. Soviet forces, having completed the encirclement, had not yet had time to build the defensive lines that would eventually make breakout attempts prohibitively costly. That window closed. The decision was irreversible once Soviet forces had time to dig in. And then came a promise that made everything worse. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, told Hitler that the Air Force could supply the Sixth Army from the air. The army needed, by German General Staff estimates, a minimum of 500 tons of supplies per day. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. To maintain combat effectiveness. Göring told Hitler the Luftwaffe could deliver this. This claim was false. Everyone with relevant expertise knew it was false. The Luftwaffe's transport capacity, even optimally deployed, was incapable of delivering 500 tons daily to an encircled army in winter conditions over heavily contested air corridors. The maximum realistic estimate, offered by Luftwaffe transport officers who examined the question honestly, was perhaps 100 tons per day. Under actual winter conditions, with Soviet fighters and flak attriting the transport fleet, the deliveries would be less. The airlift began. The average daily delivery to the Sixth Army over the next 2 months was approximately 100 tons, 1/5 of the minimum requirement. The army began to starve. In December, the plan to relieve the Sixth Army was called Operation Winter Storm. It was commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably the most operationally gifted commander in the German military. He was given what was available, a scratch force built around the 4th Panzer Army, understrength, reorganized under difficult conditions, launched from positions south and southwest of the encirclement. The operation began on December 12, 1942. Manstein's forces, spearheaded by the 57th Panzer Corps, itself built around the 6th Panzer Division recently transferred from France, drove northeast toward the 6th Army's position. The distance was approximately 100 kilometers. They covered 48 of those kilometers before Soviet resistance and the exhaustion of their logistics halted them, approximately 60 kilometers from the 6th Army's perimeter. At this point, the closest the relief force came to reaching Paulus's men, Manstein faced the central dilemma of the operation, and the German command system produced its final major error. Manstein had developed a companion plan to Winter Storm, codenamed Operation Thunderclap. If the relief force could get close enough, the Sixth Army would simultaneously break out toward the relief force, abandoning its positions in and around Stalingrad, fighting through the Soviet encirclement ring from inside while Manstein's force pushed through from outside. The two forces would link up, and a significant portion of the Sixth Army would be saved. The problem was that Thunderclap required Hitler's approval, and Hitler would not approve an operation that involved the deliberate abandonment of Stalingrad. There was also a more immediate problem. Paulus himself was deeply reluctant to initiate a breakout without explicit orders. German military culture placed extraordinary weight on the chain of command and on orders from above. Paulus had been ordered to hold. He had not been ordered to break out. Without that order, which Hitler would not give, he would not move. Manstein urged Paulus to initiate the breakout on his own authority, pointing to the brief window of opportunity represented by the relief forces' forward position. The exchange between the two generals, conducted by radio and courier through layers of encrypted communication, is one of the most agonizing in the documentary record of the war. Paulus would not move without orders. The orders did not come. The relief force, its momentum exhausted and its flanks threatened by Soviet counterattacks, was forced to halt. Then, as Operation Little Saturn, the Soviet offensive against the Italian Eighth Army on Manstein's own flank, gained momentum in mid-December, the relief force had to begin withdrawing to avoid being encircled itself. The last chance to save the Sixth Army had passed. Inside the encirclement, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Luftwaffe airlift was delivering a fraction of what was needed. The horses of the artillery teams were being slaughtered for food. Daily rations had fallen to levels that could not sustain combat effectiveness. Frostbite casualties were mounting. The wounded, tens of thousands of them, were being loaded onto the few aircraft flying out of the pocket's two airstrips, but the capacity was far below the need. And still the order to hold came down from Hitler, daily, through the chain of command. The Sixth Army held and died. January 8, 1943. Soviet General Konstantin Rokossovsky sent a delegation under a flag of truce to the German lines with an offer: surrender and receive food, medical care, and the rights of prisoners of war under international convention. The officers who were unable to continue fighting would be permitted to retain their decorations and personal effects. The offer was reasonable. By January 1943, the Sixth Army's situation was beyond military description. The outer defensive ring had contracted. The two airstrips, Pitomnik and Gumrak, were threatened, then lost, cutting off even the inadequate air supply. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers wrapped themselves in everything they could find. Men were dying not from wounds, but from cold and starvation in the basements where they sheltered. Paulus forwarded the Soviet offer to Hitler. Hitler rejected it. The Sixth Army would fight to the last. It is here that one must pause and ask the question that haunts the entire story of Stalingrad: why? Not why Hitler refused. His reasoning, such as it was, included the fear that a German surrender would encourage Soviet peace feelers to Allied governments and weaken Germany's political position. But why did the commanders of the Sixth Army comply? Some of them did not. A small number of senior German officers, including General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, the commander of the 51st Corps, advocated openly for surrender and were ignored, later facing accusations of treason. Their voices were exceptions. The majority complied because the German command culture left them no alternative framework for action. They had been formed in a tradition that equated surrender with dishonor and obedience with virtue. That tradition was now killing them. On January 10th, Soviet forces launched Operation Ring, the final reduction of the Stalingrad pocket. The encirclement ring compressed. German units, their ammunition nearly exhausted, their men barely mobile, fell back before Soviet attacks that they could not stop and could scarcely slow. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's assumption of power, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of General Feldmarschall. The message was unmistakable. No German field marshal had ever surrendered to an enemy. Hitler was, in effect, ordering Paulus to die in the ruins of Stalingrad. The alternative to death was an act that no officer of that rank had committed. Paulus chose life. On January 31st, 1943, Friedrich Paulus, Field Marshal of the German Army, walked out of the basement of the Univermag department store in central Stalingrad and surrendered to Soviet Lieutenant General Mikhail Shumilov. He was photographed, drawn, unshaved, wearing his greatcoat, in the moment that would define his historical memory forever. The northern pocket held for 2 more days. On February 2, 1943, the last organized German resistance in Stalingrad ceased. Approximately 90,000 German and Axis soldiers went into Soviet captivity. Of the 300,000 who had been surrounded in November, more than half had died during the encirclement, from cold, starvation, wounds, and combat. Of the 90,000 who surrendered in February, fewer than 6,000 would return to Germany. Most would die in Soviet prisoner of war camps over the following years. 300,000 soldiers, 6,000 survivors. The numbers require a moment. They are not statistics. They are the measure of a catastrophe produced step by step by decisions made in conference rooms and command posts, by men who told themselves they were acting rationally. In the aftermath of Stalingrad, the German command attempted something difficult, an honest assessment of what had happened. They largely failed. The inquests that followed focused primarily on proximate causes: the failure of the Romanian flanks, the inadequacy of the airlift, the failure of the relief operation. These were real factors, but they were consequences of deeper errors, and the deeper errors were ones that the German command system was structurally incapable of honestly examining. To honestly examine what had gone wrong at Stalingrad would have required admitting that Hitler's strategic direction had been catastrophically flawed from the beginning of Case Blue, that the decision to pursue two diverging objectives simultaneously was beyond German capabilities, that the decision to fixate on Stalingrad as a symbolic objective had overridden operational logic, that the decision to refuse a breakout in November 1942 had sealed the fate of 300,000 men. These admissions were impossible in a system where Hitler was the infallible strategic genius and the generals were executors of his will. The losses at Stalingrad were attributed, in the official German accounting, to the treachery of the Italian and Romanian allies, to the inadequacy of the Luftwaffe, to Soviet numbers. The fundamental decisions that had created the disaster were insulated from examination. Halder, dismissed before the catastrophe fully unfolded, wrote in his diary entries from this period with barely concealed despair. He had seen what was coming. He had said so. He had been overruled and removed. His vindication was cold comfort against the scale of the disaster. The specific errors of Stalingrad form a catalogue that military historians have studied ever since. The strategic error of Case Blue, the assumption that two major objectives could be simultaneously achieved along diverging axes with inadequate forces. The intelligence failure, the systematic underestimation of Soviet reserve strength and operational planning capability, the fixation on a symbolic objective, the transformation of Stalingrad from a secondary military target into an irreplaceable prestige goal that could not be abandoned regardless of military logic, the failure to reinforce the flanks, the assignment of Allied armies with known equipment deficiencies to positions that were subsequently attacked by the main Soviet effort, the refusal of a breakout, the single decision that most directly converted a dangerous situation into an irreversible catastrophe, the false promise of the airlift, the acceptance of an operational plan that Luftwaffe officers knew was impossible, and said so, the relief operations failure, not merely the tactical failure of Manstein's force, but the command failure that prevented the Sixth Army from moving to meet it. And finally, the decision to promote Paulus rather than order a surrender, the use of military honor as an instrument of mass death. Each error, taken alone, might have been recoverable. In combination, they produced the most complete German military defeat of the Second World War. The Wehrmacht would fight for 2 more years after Stalingrad. It would produce tactical brilliance, operational improvisation, and individual acts of extraordinary military skill. But the trajectory had been set. The ability to create the conditions for strategic victory had been exhausted. What remained was the management of defeat. Manstein, in his post-war memoir, argued that Stalingrad might have been avoided, that with different decisions at critical moments, the encirclement might not have happened or might have been broken. He was probably right. The margin between disaster and survival at several points in November and December 1942 was narrow enough that different decisions would have produced different outcomes. But the decisions were not different. They were what they were, produced by a system, a command culture, a political structure, an ideology of will over analysis, that made catastrophic error not merely possible, but in some sense, inevitable. Conclusion: the city where an army died. Return to November the 23rd, 1942. The morning the ring closed, 300,000 soldiers, surrounded in the ruins of a city that bore their enemy's name in a war they had been told they were winning, by forces that their commanders had assured them could not mount an operation of this scale. They were there because of a cascade of errors that began in a conference room in the spring and accumulated month by month, decision by decision, to this moment on the frozen steppe. The strategic plan that divided insufficient forces between diverging objectives. The intelligence system that consistently told commanders what they wanted to hear. The command culture that equated obedience with virtue and initiative with insubordination. The symbolic fixation that transformed a military objective into a test of will that could not be lost, regardless of the cost. The false promise of air supply that gave false hope when brutal honesty might still have allowed extraction. The refusal to break out when the window existed. The relief operation that came close enough to make the failure more agonizing, not less. And above all, the human beings. The 300,000 who were there not because they had made these decisions, but because the men who made the decisions wore uniforms and held ranks that demanded obedience. Stalingrad is not simply a story about military error. It is a story about what happens when a system of command loses its capacity for honest self-assessment, when the price of telling the truth becomes too high for anyone to pay it. When prestige and ideology and the fear of contradiction override the elementary calculations of what is possible and what is not. The Germans who planned Case Blue were not incompetent. The officers of the Sixth Army were not cowards. The soldiers in the ruins were not weak. They were men caught inside a system that had already made the decisions that would destroy them, and that lacked the capacity to see what it had done or to undo it when there was still time. 80 years later, the lesson of Stalingrad is not simply a military one. It is this, that competence without honesty is not competence. That an institution, military or otherwise, that cannot tell itself the truth about its failures will eventually destroy itself with them. The 6,000 who came home knew this. They carried it with them in silence for the rest of their lives. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with EpicWar. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.